We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Gimel Amud Beis and Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 53b. On the previous summer, Rav Asi said that Rabbi Yochanan said, let's say you have two fields, and there's a boundary between the two fields, and you make a chazak in one of the fields, and now the statement continues, Liknos osa v'es chaverta. Let's say the intention is that I'm going to make a kinyan on this particular field, the one I'm making the chazaka on, but also I want to make a kinyan on the neighboring field as well. Again, let's assume, for example, that these fields are hefker. Let's say a ger owned the fields, and he had no yorshim, no one to inherit him, and then he died, whatever the case is. So now you're making a chazaka on the one field in order to acquire the neighboring field. So in that case, osa kana, that field you made the chazaka on, that field you'll acquire. But chaverta lo kana, but you're not going to acquire the neighboring field. And the Gemara continues, Liknos es chaverta. Let's say you have in mind only to acquire the neighboring field. You make a chazaka on the first field in order to acquire the second field. So in that case, af osa lo kana, you're not even going to acquire that field because you're having no intention for that particular field, and the kinyan you're making on that first field is not going to work for the neighboring field. And the Rashbam explains, Liknos osa v'es chaverta. Again, let's say you're making the kinyan chazaka on the field to acquire that field and the neighboring field. Keshamachzik ba'achas neskavin liknos bechazakas u'ashtein. Again, you're making a chazak on one of them, but the intention is to acquire both of them. So osa kana levada, you only get that field. Aval chaverta lo kana, you don't get the neighboring field. Demeitzer mafsik, because the boundary line is considered to be a hefsik, it's a separation, and therefore the kinyan is not going to work for the neighboring field. And the Rashbam also notes, v'davka nichse hager. Now this halach is only true when we're talking about the property of a ger, something ownerless that you're trying to acquire. Dememei lakani, where again you're trying to be koned automatically. Hilkach ein bo koach liknos ela osa sada she'echzik ba. Therefore, you only have the strength to acquire just the field where you made the actual chazaka. Avol b'mecher, but let's say it would come to a sale. So there, Modi Rabbi Yochanan, there actually Rabbi Yochanan would admit shem hechzik be'echad mehen, that if he made a chazaka in one of them, kana kulan, then he would acquire all the fields. Kedamrin and perigrishan the Babba Kama, like we say in the first parak of Babba Kama. And the Gemara continues, boy, Rabbi Zeir. Rabbi Zeir asks the following question, Hechzik be'achas mehen, let's say I'm in a chazak in one of the fields, Liknos osa v'es hameitzer v'es chaverta, in order to acquire it, meaning that field that he made the chazak in, and also to acquire the boundary line, and also to acquire the neighboring field. Mahu, what would be the halach in that case? Mi amrina, do we say meitzer di arachadhu v'kani, that boundary line of the land, it makes it all like it's one, and he could acquire the whole thing? Odilmar, maybe haylechu dekai v'haylechu dekai, this one is independent, and that one is independent, and therefore it's not going to be effective. And the Gemara says, the Gemara leaves that as a question. And the Gemara continues, boy, Rebbe Lozer asks, Hechzik b'meitzer liknos shtehen. Let's say a person makes the chazaka on the boundary line itself in order to acquire both of the fields. Mahu, what would be the halach in that situation? And the Gemara explains, Mi amrinon hai meitzer afsara diarahu. Do we say that this meitzer, this boundary line, is like the halter of the land, like you would have on an animal? When you make a kinyan on the afsara, you acquire the animal as well, v'kani, and therefore it would be a kinyan. Odilmar, maybe haylechu dekai v'haylechu dekai. This one is independent, and this is independent. The kinyan is not going to be effective, and the Gemara says, the Gemara leaves that as a question. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua. Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Avua says, Shnei badim zel lifnim mizeh. If you have two houses, one is more inside the chutzner than the other. The idea is that the person who lives in the inner house, he has rights to walk on the property of the outer house. So in such a situation, hechzik bechitzon, if a person makes a chazaka on the outer house, liknoso, in order to acquire it, kanos, then he acquires it, he gets the outer house. Liknos oso v'es hapnimi. Let's say he does it in order to acquire it and also the inner house. So chitzon kana pnimi lo kana. So then he acquires the outer house, but he does not acquire the inner house. Liknos es hapnimi, let's say he makes a kinyan on the outer house in order to acquire just the inner house. Af chitzonami lo kana, then he won't acquire anything, he won't even acquire the outer house. However, hechzik bepnimi likno, so let's say he makes a chazak on the inner house to acquire it, so kano, then he's going to acquire the inner house. Liknos oso v'yas hachitzon, let's say he has in mind to acquire the inner house and the outer house with the chazak he's making on the inner house, kana shnein, so then he gets both of them, he acquires both of them, and the idea is again, because the person on the inside, he's going to have rights to go through the property of the person on the outside, so therefore a kinyan on the inner house with the intention of making a kinyan on both of them will acquire both of them. Now liknos now let's say he makes a kinyan on the inner house only to acquire the outer house. So in that case, af penimi lo kan. In that case, he's not even going to acquire the inner house. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua. Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Avua says, Habona palterin gedolim benichse hager. Let's say a person builds big palaces on the property of a ger. Again, this is ownerless property. The convert died. He didn't have any people to inherit him. Uba acher. Now somebody else comes, vehemid bohen delossos, and he puts up the doors of the house for these palaces. So it's the person who puts up the doors. He is the one that's going to acquire the property. And the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Because that first person who just built the palaces without the doors, livni bi'almahu da'apach, it's considered like he's just merely turning over some bricks. That's not considered an activity that's going to make a kinyan, that's going to make a chazaka. And the Gemara continues, Amar Avdimi bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Elazar. Avdimi bar Yosef says that Rabbi Elazar says, Hamotzi palter and benichse hager. Let's say a person finds palaces in the property of the convert, v'sad behen siyod echad, and he puts one plaster over there, okiyor echad, or he tiles it with one tile, kanan, so then that's enough to be kona the property. The Gemara says, v'kaman, how big an area does he have to plaster, put the tile down? Amar Rav Yosef says, Amma, it has to be at least 1 amma in size. Amar Rav Chisda says, Ucheneged HaPesach, it should be opposite the entryway. And the Rashbam explains, Kamo livne bi'almahu diapich, again, the person building these palaces is just considered like he's merely overturning bricks. Hafach leveinim bi'alma v'sidron zalzeh, he's just arranging the bricks one on the other. T'chol zman shelo hemid delossos, the point over here is, as long as the doors have not been put up, my kovid, what's he really doing? Meikara aili baravcha, originally you're able to get in easily. V'hashtanami aili baravcha, now also you're able to get in easily. The tchilas binyan eino ikar el Gemara, because the main thing is not the beginning of the building, it's the finishing. As we learned in the Mishnah, Noal v'gader, let's say you lock it, let's say you put up the fence. Dehainu hamodas delossos, effectively that's the same as putting up the doors. Avol bona kolshu lo katani, now you don't have a girsa over here of bona kolshu, we're talking here where again, he's building up but not finishing it, because the main thing is finishing it up. And the Rashbam continues, Hamotze paltron, let's say a person finds these palaces, benuyin, they're already built, and the point of this case is, ve'ein chaser klum, there's nothing missing, ve'ein lo malachadesh bebayis shatiyah chazaka, so there's nothing new to do in order to create a chazaka. That's the point of the Gemara over here. And so then the Gemara said again, you put down a little plaster, you put down a little tile, and that will be the chazaka. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Amram. Rav Amram says, Hai milso Amar lon Rav Sheshes. The following statement was said to us by Rav Sheshes, Vanharinu einin mimas nisan. He enlightened us from a brisa to support the statement. And the statement is as follows, Hamatzia matzos benichse hager. If somebody spreads out mattresses in the property of a ger, that's in order to make a kinyan on this ownerless property. So kana, so that does work and he acquires the property. Vanharinu einin mimas nisan. He enlightened us from the brisa. Mahi, what's that referring to? The Tanya refers to the following brisa. It says in the brisa, Ketzad b'chazaka, how do you acquire an eved with a kinyan chazaka? It's talking here about an eved. And the brisa goes on to say, Noal lo minalo, let's say the eved puts on his shoe, or hitter lo minalo, or he undoes the shoe, or shaholech kelev achrav lebeis hamerchatz, or he follows him and carries his clothing after him to the beis hamerchatz, to the bathhouse, ve'efshito, he undresses him, ve'erchitzo, or he bathes him, sacho or gardo, he puts on oil, or he scrapes off the oil, ve'hilbisho, ve'hinilo, he gets him dressed, he puts on his shoes, ve'higbio, or he lifts him up. The eved does any one of these things, so kano, so then the master acquires the eved. Amar Rabbi Shimon says, Lote chazaka gedola mihagba. Chazaka should be no greater than hagba, than lifting up. Shahagba kona b'chol makom, because lifting up, that creates a kinyan in all circumstances. And the Gemara says, my kamar, what exactly is being said over here? What's Rabbi Shimon talking about hagba? The Brisa wasn't talking about hagba. And so the Gemara explains, Hachi kamar, this is what it's saying. Higbio l'rabo kano, the Tanakama, the Brisa was saying, if the Eved lifts up the master, then the master acquires the Eved. But Higbia rabo lo, but let's say the master lifts up the Eved, lo kano, so that's not a kinyan. And to that, Rabbi Shimon responds, Rabbi Shimon says, Lo te chazaka gedola mehagba, chazaka should not be greater than hagba, shehagba kona b'chol makom, because lifting up is always a kinyan, and so it's a kinyan over here as well, meaning Rabbi Shimon is saying, even if the master lifts up the Eved, that is going to be a kinyan. And the Rashbam over here explains, and Noal lo, again, it's talking about the fact that the Eved put the shoe onto the master, Eved l'rabo, shashimesh l'rabo. The point is the Eved put the shoe on the master, shashimesh ha'eved l'rabo, the Eved served the master, have a chazaka, that's a chazaka v'chein kul, and that's true of all of them. Now, how is it that this brisa has anything to do with the idea of spreading mattresses and being kona property b'nichse hager? That's what the Rashbam here says. Afi siyam matzos. It's the same thing when you spread mattresses, shashimashto hakarka, that the land is essentially serving him, meaning the property is serving some function for this person. So then kana, so then we say that's an acquisition in the same way that the master acquires the Eved. And the Rashbam continues, Lote chazak, again Rabbi Shimon Shimon says chazaka should not be greater than Hagbah. Tehinil v'hilbish v'hirchitz v'hifshit gedola mehagbas Rav le'eved. They shouldn't be greater than the master lifting up the eved. V'kona Rav le'eved, and through that, through lifting the eved, the master certainly should acquire the eved. Sharei Hagbah chamuri, because Hagbah is a very strong kinyan. Tekona afila b'rishas mocher. It's kona everywhere. B'chol makom, meaning even in the property of the seller, Hagbah can be kona. Masha'ein kein b'mashichu masira. That's not really true by mashiach and masira. That can be kona everywhere. V'gam kona b'rishas ramu v'simta. Again, Hagbah can be kona in all places, in Rishas Rabbim, in a simta as well. And so therefore, since Hagbah is such a strong kinyan, it should be effective over here as well. That's what Rabbi Shimon is saying. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Bira, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yirmiyah Bira says that Rabbi Yehuda says, Hi man, this individual, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Dalid Amud Aleph.